Ah, I knew you'd come to stand before the Elden Ring, to become Elden Lord.
No one has come this far. Not for a very long while.
The pursuit of knowledge is without end, for knowledge is never a thing complete. Perhaps the same could be said of guidance. Who's to say whether we'll remain who we are, once the fight is finished?
I sought to shed the yoke of fate, but failed.
How vexing that the All-Knowing didn't have the full story.
I told the all-hearing brute that I possess no such medallion. Or have you come to take more from me? Was my other half not enough?
Queen Marika has high hopes for us, that we continue to struggle unto eternity.
I lost everything, but remain here, patiently.
I must learn all that can be taken from this place, and sear it into my memory. How could I call myself the All-Knowing if I did any less?
Knowledge is unending, knowledge is freedom, and knowledge is power. The quest for knowledge can be a tantalizing pursuit, especially when the greatest mysteries and unknowns supposedly lie on the horizon. Knowledge can drift outside the confines of sorcery or faith in order to explore new territory and findings. There are scholars of a specific kind who go against the grain of the common schools of learning in search of something new and different and potentially more vital than what established schools of magic or practices of faith can offer. The endless pursuit of knowledge is often met with great struggle, persistence, and unfortunately requires cruelty to push towards the answers to these great questions. The allure of further knowledge drives some to horrific acts under the guise of academic and righteous ideals. Knowledge comes at a price. The lives of many are used or sacrificed in order to further one's own research and experiments. The victims of these pursuits are left unknown to the rest of the world. If these victims aren't among the lost, then their suffering continues behind iron bars of a cage as an amalgamation of their former selves, prodded and dissected in the search for answers. Further knowledge often leads to corruption of one's own form or ideals. One might find themselves a shell of who they once were, or have long since abandoned their original moral values. The pursuits of both Gideon Ofnir, the All-Knowing, and Aldia, scholar of the First Sin, were failures in the never-ending search for the biggest mysteries of the lands between and Drangleic. These two not only represent the price of knowledge with their failures, but its futility. The knowledge is never a thing complete, for a lie will always remain a lie. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Elden Ring is Dark Souls 2 series. When looking at the themes of knowledge and the pursuit of it, Dark Souls 2 and Elden Ring have very similar outlooks on the subject separate from other titles. It is worth noting that the pursuit of knowledge is a common motif in all of these games, but Elden Ring and DS2 have distinct similarities with one another in my view. It's worth noting that the knowledge spoken in this video refers to knowledge of the world and its pressing issues, and not within the schools of study like faith or sorcery. The scholar motif is a similar presentation in both games in that there are prominent figures in the form of Aldia and Gideon that ponder the greater meaning of existence and seek to tackle the world's issues with a more academic perspective. It is often regarded that Elden Ring is Dark Souls 2 too, so we are bringing the discussion to how both games similarly handle knowledge and the pursuit of it at the cost of others, and the failures that come with this never-ending endeavor. Aldia is known as the scholar of the First Sin in Dark Souls 2. His life's work was the study of humanity and the First Flame. Aldia sought the answers of what the world would be without the cycle of light and dark. He often refers to this dilemma of the world being caught in this cycle as, quote, the yoke of fate. Aldia's pursuit for the secrets of life and to greater extent the world led him to begin studying the undead curse. His methods were often cruel and punishing, which forced a falling out between him and his brother Vendrick, the ruler of Drang Lake. Under seclusion in his manor, Aldia would begin to continue experimenting on humans that were invited as suggested by the description of the Spitfire spear. In addition, creations such as the Northern and Southern ritual bands were created through experiments on people of this very nature. These experiments often left these people malformed or dead. Many of the manor's inhabitants are caged creatures, suggesting that Aldia had turned these people into monstrosities such as the enhanced undead and the ogres, to name a few. He also managed to create a dragon similar to the everlasting dragons, which were the immortal beings that existed before the first age of fire during the events set before DS1. The dragon can be found at the top of the Dragon Eyrie and is merely playing a part of a dragon, or is referred to as a false deity according to Shalquar and Nashandra's dialogue. This false dragon represents the pinnacle of what Aldia was able to create with the cruel work he was doing in his manor alongside his acolytes. It was some time after that Aldia himself had transformed into a monster himself. Much like the ones he created, he could not revert to his original form. He seems to only appear at bonfires, suggesting that he might be linked to them in some way or as a physical manifestation of them. He has the appearance of a withered and burnt tree with roots that can be controlled like tentacles. He is often on fire too, suggesting a link to the bonfires and the curse of light and dark. This all culminated in an ironic failure for Aldia. He sought to better understand the undead curse and humanity, but ultimately failed to shed the yoke of fate. His failure resulted in his body becoming disfigured from his original form, much like his victims. Knowledge, in this case, is presented as a search for answers at the cost of others, and the results leading to failure. Aldia's cruel work left him empty-handed by the events of Dark Souls 2. There are some questions that will forever be left unanswered and understood, and Aldia's failure to accept this natural aspect of life resulted in his failure as a scholar of the first sin. The problem with knowledge is that one cannot understand everything, and the pursuit to understand everything leads to one's demise, especially when dealing with grand concepts such as the true essence or purpose of humanity. When Aldia meets and guides the bearer of the curse during their journey, he often subjects them to long-winded bouts of philosophy and rhetorical questions. Questions such as, what is a king? What do you seek? Do we intend to shed the yoke of fate? And what do we want truly for the world and its future? Aldia's approach to knowledge after his failure is one more of curiosity that is projected onto the bearer of the curse. He sees the bearer as the one likely to find the answers that he could not. He accepts that his knowledge drove him to lose everything, leaving him with only one thing to do: wait for the answers. Aldia's cruelty led him to somewhat of a better understanding, but not to the true answers of the world, the cycle of light and dark, and the undead curse. Through the bearer of the curse's actions, depending on which path they choose, Aldia would begin to witness what answers might lie ahead for the world and humanity if the bearer chose to forge their own path outside the confines of light and dark. Aldia's humility towards his failures shows some potential remorse or acknowledgement for his wrongdoing through his work. Aldia takes interest in the bearer of the curse as an experiment or test of his own to see if the true answers could be found within this, quote, young hollow's actions. All he can do is simply wait, since every option he implemented was unsuccessful. Knowledge or understanding begins with the recognition of one's own ignorance, as another renowned scholar once said. A similar scholar or learned individual can be found in the lands between in Elden Ring. Gideon Ofnir, the all-knowing, much like Aldia, seeks the knowledge no one dares to uncover or comprehend. As indicated by the all-knowing scepter, Gideon's weapon, it depicts a hand grasping a pearl. The pearl represents the world, while the hand represents the all-knowing's grasping for it. The same pearl is adorned with an eye, suggesting the many forms of knowledge according to the weapon description. Knowledge in this case, again, is outside of the schools of magic and faith and instead leans more into unraveling the mysteries of the world and its major conflicts. Gideon, like the player, is a Tarnished seeking to become Elden Lord and also manages the Round Table Hold, the place of refuge for those who are tarnished and the lands between. We can usually find him in his study reading over hundreds of tomes stacked throughout the room. Once the Tarnished has proven their worth to become a full member of the Round Table, Gideon will divulge his personal goals and aims. He seeks to become Elden Lord and become all-knowing, hence his obsession of acquiring information through the player's actions and intel, in addition to his many spies and agents. The Tarnished throughout their journey can gather intel for Gideon in exchange for incantations and other powerful spells. He initially aims to work together with the Tarnished despite being in competition with them. He has a particular fixation on Miquella, stating that he still remains a mystery to even him, the All-Knowing. Gideon especially appreciates intel on Miquella in particular. Besides claiming the part, Gideon's entire appearance reflects his obsession for knowledge, with his armor, which is adorned with eyes and ears, representing how he acquires information himself or through his associates like Ensha and Henricus. Gideon, much like Aldia, displays cruelty in the pursuit of knowledge of the lands between and its current conflict. The most glaring example of his cruelty is the ransacking of the Albinoric village in Liurnia. He sought the halves of the Halictree Medallion in order to gain access to Elphael and the mysteries within. Miquella is of particular interest to Gideon, suggesting that finding Miquella might be his prime motivation for wanting access to the Halictree and Elphael. The Albinorics were completely slaughtered by his agents, including an Omen Killer in his service. There was only one surviving Albinoric sane enough to speak, known as Albus. He only managed to survive because he was disguised as a pot, possibly with something similar to the Mimic's veil. As his dialogue states, the village is finished. A village that operated as a safe haven for the Albinorics, who are considered subhuman in the lands between, was leveled to the ground at the command of Gideon. He preys upon the weakest in order to gain knowledge or information to aid his own selfish intentions. Much of his knowledge is done through others doing his dirty work for him. The player even finds themselves under similar employment. Much like Aldia, the disposal of life is of little concern to him. Knowledge takes precedence over everything else. Gideon and Ensha also managed to interrogate Latenna, an Albinoric woman who they believed to possess the medallion. The interrogation resulted in the death of Lobo, Latenna's wolf, or quote, other half. Albinoric women are tied to their wolves both emotionally and physically, since they cannot walk and often ride them to move around, so losing Lobo was like losing a part of herself. Gideon's adopted daughter, Nefeli Lu, a warrior from the Badlands, learns of Gideon's genocide of the Albinorics and is disowned when she argues against his actions. She states, "My father cast me out for indulging my emotions, forgetting the mission. Punishment for offing his pawns. Lord Gideon has offered me guidance all my life. I would have done anything for him, to place him on the throne of Elden Lord. And yet I, though it was not my intent, I betrayed him. I can no longer trust in Father, to think he'd order his men to enact such tragedy. Where is the justice he purports in that? He once told me that if he became Elden Lord, he would never allow the downtrodden to be cheated ever again. Was he simply lying to me? How could I say that? Father has always given me his guidance, and now I've lost it." Nefeli's sorrow indicates how Gideon treats those in his service. They are discarded once they have exhausted their usefulness or have gone against his views or aims. Nefeli's dialogue here also suggests that he might have had pure intentions at one point until his continued consumption of knowledge ate away at his morals. Much like in the case of Aldia, knowledge comes at a price, and to delve deeper, greater sacrifices must be made in order to continue the endless pursuit. The original intentions of knowledge might be to aid or to help others and the world at large, but ultimately this path often leads to corruption, greed, and violent acts. The final interaction with Gideon is a duel at the Erd Tree Sanctuary in Leyndell, now covered in ash. Gideon gloats with that iconic pose that he knew that the Tarnished was coming, and that he states that Marika wants the Tarnished to continue to struggle for eternity. This revelation shared by Gideon suggests that he believes that he knows the truths of the world and what the future might hold. This is further reinforced by his armor description that states, "Armor set with countless eyes and ears, worn by Gideon Ofnir, the All-Knowing. Knowledge begins with the recognition of one's own ignorance, the realization that the search for knowledge is unending." But when Gideon glimpsed into the will of Queen Marika, he shuddered in fear at the end that should not be. The end that should not be could have different interpretations on what exactly that is or entails. For the purpose of this video and the themes of knowledge and its fruitless pursuits, this could mean that there is literally no ending to the ongoing struggle of the Tarnished, the demigods, and the stasis of the lands between. With this view in mind, Gideon perhaps received a revelation that there could be no possible resolution to the conflict the Tarnished seek to mend by becoming Elden Lord. He might be suggesting that nobody can become Elden Lord. Much like the knowledge and its pursuit, the supposed continued struggle Marika desires would be endless. Much like the cycles of light and dark, this glimpse that Gideon had could be a never-ending loop, leaving him fearful that no fix to the troubles of the lands between could be achieved. Progress would be forever in a stalemate. This dialogue from Gideon plays on the irony and hubris of knowledge, suggesting that knowledge can never be fully complete or known. He forgets his own words and purpose as scholar of everything possible in the lands between. Here he thinks he has found the answer, and that there could only be one answer. His resurrection, and by greater extension, the resurrection of all Tarnished and life in the lands between, could be one cruel joke to keep the world and the order as is for eternity. He assumes rather than knows the fate of the Tarnished, and it is sealed with this glimpse into Marika's supposed will. His fear clouds his judgment and ultimately leads to his failure as the proclaimed all-knowing. His fear of the stagnation of the world is what leads him to attack us. He sees no other way out from this stasis. The end that should not be, or the yoke of fate, are not so different from one another. Aldea seeks to remove the world or humanity from the cycle, while Gideon fears the potential stasis the lands between could be in for eternity. Gideon fears the unknown in this case, while Aldea is curious about the potential unknowns in his own respective separate story. The concepts of the yoke of fate and the end that should not be are the results of a world in stasis or unending cycles. The inhabitants of these worlds are unable to progress beyond these points. Both scholars seek to answer these grand questions of the world only to be met with unknowns and commit horrific acts amounting to little. They are both failed scholars who took their research too far only to end up empty-handed when it came to understanding their worlds and their biggest problems. In a final attempt to deter the Tarnished from their goals, Gideon states that a man cannot kill a god, suggesting that the end or answers cannot be attained because the Elden Beast, and by greater extension the Greater Will, cannot be harmed or killed if Marika's will is supposedly to keep the state of the lands between as is. He sees this as a cruel joke to the Tarnished, and that their efforts have been for nothing. They have come this far only to be met with a fight against a literal god. To Gideon, this task is impossible, but what he forgets is that knowledge begins with one's own ignorance. This time it happens to be his own ignorance, by his assumption that immediately all is lost. Gideon fails to understand that anything is indeed possible, and that the outcomes are endless, or what he glimpsed was not actually Marika's true will. Aldea, by comparison, was able to recognize his own ignorance and let the bearer of the curse make the decision and work towards the mysteries of the world. Gideon, of course, was unable to resist. Much like Ensha, he got a bit ahead of himself. It is also possible that this revelation that struck fear into Gideon did not come from Marika, but actually Radagon, since he is the more likely of the two to want to repair the world and keep things relatively the same. After all, Marika and Radagon are the same person. Perhaps he mistook the revelation's true sender. This message or vision Gideon saw could be from Radagon or someone else aside from Marika's will. However, further evidence would be needed in the expansion DLC or community research to be sure. The irony lies in the notion that he cannot see past his own endless quest and accept the unknowns or possibilities. His fear is what ultimately betrays him and clouds his ability to learn or investigate further. He essentially is stunned with no rationale left to think or act clearly. The pursuit of knowledge in terms of both the Tarnished and the Bearer of the Curse's journey could suggest that the true answers lie in one's own actions rather than in books or study. The act of not knowing what might be in store but pushing onwards anyways is the deterrent of the type of knowledge Gideon and Aldea seek. The player in both games is expressing pursuit of knowledge in a more primal or experiential sense, rather than its acquisition through books, history, artifacts, magic, or experimentation. Knowledge in both DS2 and Elden Ring specifically is the pursuit of answering the world's biggest questions and mysteries. It is often about understanding the concepts many are too fearful or unable to comprehend. The lands between and Drang Lake are places of enigma that can never be fully understood. Both Gideon and Aldea are prime examples of the price that comes with the pursuit and dangers of knowledge. Both of these characters were corrupted by their aims. They could not shake the possibility of endless possibilities or see the futility of answering these questions that likely cannot be answered. The answer might have been right in front of them all along, they just couldn't see it. Fear and perhaps madness drove them beyond their original morals, values, and in some case, their physical form. They lost everything because all they sought to accomplish meant little in the grand scheme of things. It wasn't until those who had the strength to persevere and shape a world in their image that those answers could be explored under a new or different rule. Knowledge is never complete, and knowledge never will be complete. To be all-knowing or to escape the yoke of fate, or the end that should not be, first starts with not participating in those respective, infinite, fruitless pursuits of knowledge. Perhaps the less we know, the better. With all these concepts in mind, feel free to let me know your thoughts on knowledge and its representation through Gideon and Aldea, and by extension Elden Ring and DS2. I found that the more that I looked into both of these characters, the more similarities that there were. In many ways, they pursue knowledge in similar fashion, but how they react or view knowledge is rather different, but play off one another rather well. Aldea's curiosity and Gideon's fear serve as nice alternating stances on the same theme in both games. They may not necessarily be evolutions of one another, but they do really highlight the ideas and themes surrounding the price of knowledge and what it means to be knowledgeable in their respective games. Gideon definitely has a lot less humility than Aldea, and that shows in how his final interaction goes. While I can see why Gideon fights the player towards the end of the game, one aspect I have never quite understood in parallel is why Aldea fights the player at the end of DS2 beyond just simply testing them. If you have any thoughts or ideas on that, feel free to let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you all think about that in particular. There are also many mechanical similarities such as their boss fight presentation and function as NPCs. I believe these two have the most dialogue out of any character in Soulsborne, so that seems rather fitting given that they are both scholars and knowledgeable individuals on their respective worlds. They also function as guides offering some direction for the player too, which further aids those similarities of gameplay function. I also see both characters as a sort of representations of the futility of even understanding the stories and lore of these games. Many of us get into the lore and can be like Gideon or Aldea, pondering the meaning of these concepts, item descriptions, and dialogue without having the full story, myself included. I'm sure many of us have had that trademark Gideon hunch from reading wikis and watching videos since Elden Ring came out. We like to think we all know something, but there is always a contradiction or gap in our knowledge.
Ah, my apologies. Lost myself for a moment there.
Anyways, thanks so much for watching. If you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. I appreciate you taking the time to check out this video and the channel, as well as sharing your thoughts in the comments. The discourse on these past videos has been great, so put on your ICER coat and let me know what you think down below. I'll exchange any findings you might have for further videos. Take care, and I hope to see you again in the next one.
These namby-pamby tarnished think us no more than a shelter from the rain.